Okay, look, it's 5 o'clock, so I think we might make a start, and there may be more people joining us over the next couple of minutes. But welcome to everyone to this Making Public History's webinar about Australia's marine environment. Very pleased to see you all from different parts of the state and around Australia. I'm Al Thompson from Monash Uni, and I'll be chairing this webinar. Let me just start by saying that I'm on Wurundjeri country in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, and we'll have colleagues from all over the country and the state from different Indigenous country. And I just want to pay to recognise the original Indigenous custodians of the land on which each of us is during this event, and pay respects to elders both past, present and emerging. These Making Public History webinars or seminars have been going since 2008. For the best part of 18 months, we've been online, which means that we haven't been able to meet at the old Treasury building, which is a real shame, but it does mean we can have colleagues from other states and regional Victoria joining us easily, which is great. The seminars are a collaboration between the History Council of Victoria, History at Monash and the old Treasury building. And as I say, it's a shame we can't be there, but Margie Anderson from Old Treasury building is with us helping organise these seminars. I'm joined in running these events by my colleagues Alicia Serrato from the History Council and Susie Prochke, who's now at Deakin University, and Margie Anderson from Old Treasury Building. Let me just say a little bit about how these events work. Basically, those of you who've joined us, the webinars, you're probably pretty familiar with them by now, but they're a bit different from normal Zoom meetings. Basically, we've got three presenters, and I'm going to introduce each of them before each of them speaks. They've each got between 12 and 15 minutes and then 5 minutes for Q&A. And then we'll have a larger Q&A session at the end of all the presentations. If during the presentations you've got any questions or comments you want to make, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical issues, use the chat button and use that to let us know, and we'll try. One of us will get back to you and try and sort things out. If anybody's, certainly if any of the presenters' internet connection gets slow or disrupted, then we'll continue in voice rather than video mode. I need to let you all know that we're recording this webinar tonight, and the recording will be available in a few days' time on the History Council of Victoria's website. And that just means if you're asking a question or making a comment on Q&A, just let us know if you'd rather be anonymous. Otherwise, we may well say who the question is from, which would be nice. And of course, keep your questions polite and respectful. I think that's all I need to do by way of introduction. So I'm going to start by introducing our first speaker, Lynette Russell. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and if all the other presenters, if you can mute your videos now, and I'll do the same in a moment. But delighted to welcome my Monash colleague, Lynette Russell, who's a laureate professor at Monash and director of the Global Encounters and First Nations People, 1,000 Years of Australian History, which is such an exciting project, Lynette. Lovely to have you with us. Lynette's going to be talking about looking out, looking in, visitors from the sea, rethinking ocean voyages with Indigenous Australians. So over to you, Lynette.
Thank you very much, Al. Thank you to the History Council of Victoria for the invitation. And obviously thank you to my two co-panellists, Joe and Sandra. I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say as well. I begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on the unceded lands of Naarm, what we now call Melbourne, and I'm actually based in the lands of just recently discovered that we have had a slight change, and I'm on Boonwurrung land. But I still like to acknowledge the Kulin Nations. So what I'm going to do tonight is just talk a little bit about my past work, present work and future work, particularly as it relates to the sea. Although my ancestors, my Aboriginal ancestors were very much desert people, I've always looked to the sea for inspiration. As a child here in Naarm, I spent a lot of time on the Mornington Peninsula where my grandparents lived, and went on the bay with a lot of fishing in my grandfather's boat almost every weekend. My work as a historian of Indigenous Australia has increasingly become interesting. I've become increasingly interested in coastal engagements, maritime encounters, mobility and agency. Indigenous people, I believe, have been far too often prefigured as rooted in place. And while obviously the importance of the concept of country can't be undersold, and it's absolutely central to First Nations cultures, I think the ocean too is vitally important. So the ocean has been pivotal to my work, particularly the work I did on the maritime industries of whaling and sealing, which culminated in a series of articles, and the book, Roving Mariners. I was deeply affected by the work of Greg Denning and his experiential approach to history, particularly while I was doing that book. And as a result, spent a lot of time on ships hunting whales, though with a camera, not a harpoon. The thing that strikes me whenever you're on one of those boats looking at whales is just their sheer enormity. Sperm whales, you have to sort of see them to believe them. And blue whales or sulphur bottoms are quite simply impossible to comprehend without having seen one. Even a rendered skeleton that can hover over you at a museum suspended by steel wires still doesn't really give you a sense of what their size is like when they're actually in the water. When I was working on Roving Mariners, and I was particularly interested in Aboriginal mariners, Aboriginal whalers, and also, of course, people who worked in the whaling and sealing industry, both men and women, I often turned to fiction such as that written by Herman Melville, particularly Moby Dick, obviously, Typee, Umu, and Redburn, White Jacket, and of course the famous Billy Budd. All of his wonderful whaling books, and a great deal of what we know about 19th century whaling actually comes from the whaling novels of Melville. And of course, through his writing, I came to appreciate that polyglot checkerboard crew, the African, Lascar, Pacific Islander, Aboriginal, Australian, Native American, Native Canadian, Native Hawaiian, American and British sailors. Although it was really through Melville that I came to understand that the sea was not a barrier to be crossed, but a great highway, as he wrote. All the watery regions is much like some noted four corners of a great highway, where you will meet more travellers than in any other place. My ocean experience enabled me a consideration of perspective, particularly as it applied to Indigenous Australians. And as a result, my thinking has ebbed and flowed. Most importantly, in thinking about the ocean from the ocean rather than the ocean from the land, has led me to shift the paradigms with which I work. These shifts have destabilised things that I once took as certain and solid. And I believe those shifts have been fruitful, and they have the potential to enable us to develop understandings of the past that are as profound and deep as the Mariana Trench. The sea, the ocean, is a vehicle. It can facilitate movement. For some people, it's also home, be it temporary or, in the case of the so-called sea gypsies, the Sama Bayou, their actual home. A number of years ago, I read Daniel Richter's Facing East from Indian Country, and it fundamentally changed the way I do history. May I think about history? It challenged me. He challenged us to see the European arrival in America, not from the deck of the boat, but instead to compose our historical imaginings so that we might imagine for a moment to be standing on the beach, looking out to sea, in a very similar way to the way that Inga Clendenin observed the East Coast first contact, where initially the Eora and the British were cautiously but friendly, where they sang and began to dance. Misunderstandings, of course, abound and tensions arose, but I thought it was really beautiful the way that Clendenin looked at that particular event with a real eye for detail. Later, when Governor Phillip was injured, a spear was thrown at him. Clendenin was really clever because she didn't simply accept that it was, the normal explanation is the man panicked, he'd thrown it in fear. But instead, she argued that explanation left too much of the incident unexplained, and instead suggested the Eora had performed a ritual to humble Phillips, who had hurt them, without destroying their larger alliance with him. I don't know if anyone else had the privilege that I had today, and that was to sit and listen to Kate Fulliger talk about Bennelong in her National Library fellowship lecture. It was just absolutely wonderful. I'm very excited about the opportunities that we've got to now see some of these actions of people on the sea, on the beach, who travelled by sea through fresh eyes. When the Europeans first set out to discover, map, exploit and tame Terra Australis incognita, they were setting out onto a great unknown land. Possibly a few hundred years earlier, Macassan fishers had ventured into Australia's northern waters in search of trade items, turtle shell, trepang and other. They were obviously not the first people to arrive here, down under, as the ancestors of our first peoples had arrived at least 70 millennia earlier. Now, for some Aboriginal people, they maintain that they have always been here. Australia is where for other Aboriginal people, Australia is where they became Aboriginal. And for others, 70,000 years or so is in the realm of forever anyway. Recent computer modelling that's been undertaken by some of my colleagues in the Centre of Excellence in Biodiversity and Heritage, where I'm a co-director, have shown that these first voyages to Australia, perhaps over 70 millennia ago, like the later European and Macassan ones, were deliberate and purposeful. Human beings are explorers. They want to know what lies over the horizon. They're driven to map their world as it is encountered. But what can we surmise from these voyages, their participants? What did they bring with them? How did they survive? What food did they have? What tools did they have? Indeed, what did they have in their boat to ensure that they sailed across those vast distances and didn't perish? What happened when those worlds collided, however briefly? I've just noticed a lovely typo in my paper. I've got over the course of the next 5 years. Over the course of the next 5 years, I am very privileged to have the opportunity to really start to study these voyages, particularly the European voyages and the Macassan voyages, but it does give me opportunity to think about those older voyages, the voyages where Aboriginal people first arrived here. Exploring those shifting phases of visits to Australia up to the mid-19th century and considering the interactions, the impacts, the relationships, and ultimately the unfinished business of sea-based encounters. Much of my work has been framed by a desire to design a decentering of the importance of Europe and especially Britain as a hegemonic entity. I want to focus on a range of experiences that have taken place on the ocean, and I want to find the capacity or to explore the capacity to engage with the period that I've been examining, which in this case is going to be, we've said the last 1,000 years or the past 1,000 years. I think the relationships that emerged out of these encounters have been hampered largely by our failure to engage with other disciplines. I think there's a lot to be said for working in an interdisciplinary space, and I'm very keen to work with archaeologists and dating people in museums and elsewhere so that we can really get a sense of the depth of this material. I'm talking about an archive that is not merely text, but an archive of botany, an archive of ship design, an archive that includes language terms, that includes a whole range of things that we won't necessarily as historians think of as archival. I've very much been deeply affected by my engagement with the work of my colleagues Ian McNiven and John Bradley, who've deeply influenced my thinking on this, particularly the work that Ian has undertaken on saltwater people, their relationships, spiritual, ritual and economic to the sea. It's as brave and provocative as it is challenging. When I start to think about the peopling of Sahul, which is what Australia was at the time, or the Great Australian Landmass as it was known, I'm very much drawn to the idea that we've been utterly land-centric. My feeling is that people who lived on the sea probably had a much better understanding of how to engage with the watery realm than the rest of us. Alison Bashford noted in her wonderful Terra Aqueous Histories that she documented the shift from imperial to world to naval to oceanic. If imperial has become world, so naval might become oceanic for the 21st century. This shift captures pressing conversations that link maritime history, world history, and environmental history. To return to Herman Melville, who reminds us that 2/3 of our fair world is covered by water, our blue planet reminds us of this. Of course, it's up to each and every one of us to do our bit, and I want to apologise, maybe not, but I won't, because I think oceanic history of the environment, can reveal a great deal. And most importantly, I think it's important that we learn from it. I started talking about whaling when I began this talk. It was one of the most important industries of this planet. Whales may have been saved from hunting, but we now need to save the very medium in which they swim. My laureate project intends to reorient understandings of Australian history by exploring First Nations records, as I said, archival records in the very broadest sense. It also examines Indigenous knowledge from traditions from mainland Australia and Tasmania and Torres Strait, all engaging with people who arrive from the sea, asking for a broad timeframe changes and contextualising narratives. Global Encounters is a multilingual, multidisciplinary team. We're all working in an intellectual space using traditional and non-traditional archives in the reconstruction of context and complexity of an encounter. Some of our non-traditional archives, as I mentioned, include oral tradition, linguistic evidence, loan words, rock art, botanical evidence, archaeological evidence, disease and genetic factors. And of course, there's the traditional archives, which thanks to COVID, we haven't even been able to visit yet. The European archives, which is very rich and filled with potential, is, of course, over 400 years old. One of the outcomes of the project is a massive cultural gateway and interactive database, which we've started working on, where each encounter is translated and recorded as a separate field. Over 150 coastal nations with diverse languages and cultures and social organisations, trade networks and economies and histories, as well as varied topography, food resources and environmental niches are all going to be included. And very excitingly, we're working with people in the IT faculty who are visualising this for us and animating it. So eventually you'll be able to stand on the bow of a Dutch ship as it approaches the Australian landmass, but at the same time, you'll be able to stand on the landmass, on the coast, on the beach, and look out and see the Dutch ship approach. Last year, 250 years after Cook's voyage along the east coast, it was certainly timely to begin this project and to start considering Indigenous responses, both historical and contemporary. Sorry. I'm certain that the historical actors that I have studied in the past did not conceive of the sea as a barrier. It was a medium, as I said. And when you read the journals of people like Cook or indeed Banks and all the journals of earlier explorers, including the Dutch, you do find that the sea is never seen as a barrier. It's always a place. It's a medium, as I say. It's something that you can move through. When we study the ocean, it's different again. When we think of the seabed, for example, say of Bass Strait, where Aboriginal people thousands of years ago walked across it as it was a plain with a big lake in the middle, the Bassian Lake, we have to think about these as still Aboriginal landscapes, and I think that's really important. The sea and the land are intimately connected, intimately. Their histories are intertwined, they're enmeshed. I think it's really important that we need to stop thinking about that there is land, there is ocean, or there's just the two. I would argue it's all connected. The sea is the land is the sea. We have sea country, we have land country. And I think it's terribly important that as historians, we approach all of this with the eye of an interdisciplinary scholar, which I hope over the next few years we're going to achieve. So thank you for that.
Thanks very much, Lynette. Let me now introduce my colleague Alicia Serretto from the History Council Victoria, and Alicia is going to chair the Q&A.
Thanks, Al, and thanks, Lynette, for starting us off. And, you know, you've certainly got me thinking. Whilst everyone has a look and thinks about the questions they want to ask you. So if you put your questions in the chat, in the Q&A box, not the chat box, if you can manage it, just in the bottom menu bar there. But Lynette, I was so interested in that perspective shift, moving from the notion of the ocean from the land, instead looking at the ocean from the ocean.
Yes, yeah, there's some, I mean, in fact, I was just recently reading something that Sandra wrote, and he was talking about, you know, again, the Cook journeying towards the particularly around Point Hicks. And it's just such a lovely way of thinking about these interactions, these encounters. They're so profound. And I'm absolutely certain for Aboriginal people, it must have been astonishing to see these great ships arrive. And one of the things we've been doing is collecting the stories and the songs that are associated with the arrival. And they're often, we saw a great bird, or there was they've translate these into immediately recognisable from their own epistemology, what they can see. And I think that's a lovely part of this. It's going to really, literally sing off the page.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes to what you're saying too about the cross-disciplinary work that seems necessary in this field.
Yes, absolutely. And that's one of the things that really strikes me is no one of us can do all of this. We're talking about the Macassans, for example. They're absolutely fascinating. We have oral history. We have some archival records on the Macassans, but then we have our deep understanding of the Macassans. It comes from archaeology. It comes from the things that they left behind. And then more recently, we've started thinking about, the botanical evidence. One of the ways that you can determine where the Macassans was is from the evidence of tamarind trees, because they would bring with them balls of tamarind. The fruit contains seeds. The seeds would become incorporated into the soil. The soil would then grow a tree. And you can now identify where the Macassans went by the presence of these tamarind trees. So we're now looking. I spent yesterday having quite a long conversation with someone who potentially can go in and do some dating of some very ancient tamarind trees in northern Australia, which may add to the story of when the Macassans came.
Yes, okay. And I imagine scientists as well would be have some interesting input into what you're looking at.
Absolutely. And of course, there's, as I mentioned, genetics. That's another thing. Across the top end of Australia, we have a number of particularly unusual illnesses, diseases. Mercado-Joseph disease particularly, which is experienced quite prominently by the Yolngu people. And that is, again, something that was brought in probably from the Macassans, but almost certainly via the Portuguese. Because this particular rare disease, the genetic fingerprint of it is quite well known. So this project, this huge project, which I inadvertently called it, instead of a course of 5 years, a curse of 5 years, perhaps it is a curse because it's not nearly long enough, that really is synthesising huge amounts of data and including all those odd things that we find from time to time will be appearing, coins from Tanzania found on the beach in Darwin. What on earth does that mean? These sorts of things, you get them in the newspaper, popular press for a week or two. They end up in a museum somewhere. We're now going to synthesize these into our database and make sure that they're given proper academic, scholarly attention. And we may end up saying, well, they're nothing, but that doesn't matter. It's important that we do that work.
Go through that. And in what ways would you say moving from a land-centric to an ocean perspective will change the way that we understand our history?
I think, again, I do think that for so long it's a sense of people are just moving to get to the East Coast, or to the West Coast or to the North Coast. They're moving, that's where they're going. But actually there's a whole lot of things happening on those ships, including when they pick up and take. One of the things we're looking at is kidnapping, where and this happens right throughout the Pacific, and it certainly happens in Australia, where some really, they're really very difficult stories to read. It's very powerful and painful stuff. But you've got people particularly women, being kidnapped and taken on board the boat. There's a particularly, poignant one where one of the Dutch describes having selected 3 of the most comely young girls to, quote, service the crew, and then they were then disposed of. These are stories that are really powerful and not really very well known, so I think we need to tell those as well.
Now, we've had a couple more questions come in from the audience, and Alice wants to know, will the project explore the way that people have used and understood the in-between, the tidal zones that have so troubled Europeans and their notions of property?
Absolutely. I think that's a really important one. And with shifting sea level and all the rest, I think that's very important. So yes, the answer to that is most definitely.
Mm-hmm. And then would the mahogany ship, this is from Ian, and the ancient quays found at Lime Burners Point in Geelong be part of this narrative?
Actually, Ian, all of those unusual things there, as I said, the Kilwa key coins, the Corio keys, the mahogany ship, if such a thing exists, all of those things are going to end up in our data. Yeah. We want to leave nothing unstudied.
It sounds just, my kids would say epic, but epic in its real sense. It does sound like a big adventure, a big challenge that you're
absolutely epic. In fact,
approaching.
The Centre of Excellence that I co-direct is called, our website is called Epic Australia.
Oh, there you go. Now we've got a couple more questions about the Tamarind Tree. Someone said, I thought the Tamarind Tree was Indigenous. So this is from Shamima, Indigenous to Africa and brought to India. When did it first come to Australia?
That is indeed correct. It is Indigenous to Africa, then brought to India, and then up through the Middle East and down through Southeast Asia. We don't know when it came to Australia. We're guessing, which is precisely why I had that conversation yesterday with a dating specialist who's going to attempt to date some of the very old, gnarly, huge tamarind trees in Northern Australia. So.
It does feel like you're not going to leave any stone unturned. So
I hope not.
Yeah, fantastic. And Peter's got a question here. Do you want to reflect on the maritime imagery of the ancient rock art of the Kimberley, the so-called Bradshaw painting?
Sure. The Bradshaws probably don't quite fit into this particular discussion, but certainly the images of ships do. And there's some fantastic work that's only just been published by Paul Tayson, Sally May and some other colleagues looking at how representations of European ships in rock art are really quite prolific, but representations of the Macassan ships are not so prolific. And their argument is people start to make representations of these vessels when they are in when their sovereignty is being threatened. So the response to the Macassans is a much more egalitarian. So, yes.
Thank you, Lynette. Thank you for taking the time to answer those questions. And Al's going to come back on and I'll thank you all for your questions.
Great. Thanks, Alicia, and thanks very much, Lynette. And we'll bring you back in, Lynette, for the Q&A at the end. So thanks a lot. Just for those of you who've joined us while Lynette was speaking, just to remind you, this is the Making Public Histories seminar about Australia's marine environment. And we're lucky enough to have 3 different historians, each from a different part of Australia, reflecting on the different contexts and cultures and addressing key issues in the history and politics of Australia's marine environment and its exploitation and conservation. And I'm delighted now to introduce our second speaker, Sandra Antonello, who's a historian at Flinders in Adelaide, who, like us in Melbourne, is currently locked down. Sandra works on the environmental history and the history of science of Antarctica and oceans globally in the 20th and 21st century, and is the author of The Greening of Antarctica, Assembling an International Environment, which was published in 2019. So over to you, Sandra.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me and see my slides. Firstly, hello, I'm on Kaurna country and I'd like to pay my respects to Kaurna elders past and present. This evening, protecting and possessing the cold Southern Ocean. So the Southern Ocean has been in the news a bit recently. In late June, National Geographic announced that it would finally put the Southern Ocean on its maps. To Australians, this might have seemed like an odd announcement, since, of course, the name is quite familiar to us. But, and this is to introduce you to the Southern Ocean I'll be speaking about today, National Geographic's definition, drawing from the draft definition of the International Hydrographic Organization, states that the Southern Ocean is the ocean surrounding Antarctica below 60 degrees south latitude. This made Australians wonder, isn't the Southern Ocean the sea that washes our southern shores? The Adelaide Advertiser, my wonderful hometown paper or new hometown paper, even wondered if this new definition might set us adrift. Is the Southern Ocean where we think it is? But even the National Geographic definition doesn't quite suit what oceanographers and other scientists now refer to as the Southern Ocean. And so I'm defining Southern Ocean in this contemporary way. It is the cold ocean that surrounds the Antarctic continent, flowing from east to west. It is bounded to its north by a boundary named the Antarctic Convergence, or the Antarctic Polar Front, which is where the cold Antarctic waters give way relatively rapidly to the warmer waters in the north. The Southern Ocean is characterized by a fairly simple ecosystem with short trophic relations. So krill, Antarctic krill, is the keystone species which most other animals, whales, many seals, birds, penguins, fish, eat. There are some islands within the Southern Ocean, including Australia's Heard Island, and Australia's Macquarie Island is just to the north of the convergence, but still in quite cold territory. So what is Australia's story in this ocean? It's a short time I have tonight, so I'm going to give you a sort of one version of this story in the 20th and 21st centuries, with two themes indicated in my title: possessing, by which I mean not only territorial control and sovereignty, but exploitation and harvesting, and protecting. At the beginning of the 20th century, Australians were focusing on the Antarctic continent and the southern latitudes. It was a larger moment in which European imperial powers were racing to the geographic South Pole. But the Australian thinking of the ocean and the region at this time wasn't simply one of discovery or firsts, important though these were. Connected with the larger ideology of useful science in the colonies, there was a strong sense that in the Southern Ocean and Antarctica would be essential resources and knowledge to ensure Australia's economic prosperity. In the 1880s, a Melbourne-based committee for Antarctic Exploration, with the famed botanist von Mueller as chair, had a thoroughly economic outlook for the region. Climatological and meteorological knowledge were central here, and here on this slide, the work of the geologist J.W. Gregory, who was briefly chair of geology at the University of Melbourne, pursued these climatological questions, understandable in a country just ravaged by the Federation drought. And on this slide, you can see the very characteristic blank map of the ocean and continent at this time, featureless, much to be discovered. And I would sort of add by implication, given the imperialistic times, Australia having just tried to, and in the process still of colonizing Papua, this is a region for Australia to possess. Following this, the dominant figure in Australia's Antarctic history in the first half of the 20th century, known I'm sure to most, if not all of you, is the famed Douglas Morrison. In addition to the scientific and geographic discovery he wanted to achieve for Australia and for himself, he clearly understood that the Southern Ocean was a source of marine resources. He often mentioned resources, especially whales and seals, when he was speaking in public and trying to drum up funds for his own expeditions, as well as sort of drum up cultural interest in the continent and the region. Antarctic whaling, it should be stressed, in the Southern Ocean really only began to take off after 1904, when commercial whaling began in South Georgia, which is in the South Atlantic. Whaling quickly became a very significant industry, aided by certain technological developments, most notably the development of the hydrogenation of oils. So whale fat could be turned into margarine. And by the 1920s, whaling was also occurring to a great extent off East Antarctica. So that's the area between Australia and the Antarctic continent. Morrison embodied a kind of exploitation conservation dynamic in this time. Oh, sorry. So he was absolutely considering that whales and seals were rich and harvestable resources. But for Morrison, as for certain other scientists at the time, these were animals, these were sort of floating bodies of resource, which needed authority. So then the ocean being sort of free from states, they still considered that whales and seals needed some kind of authority over them. Otherwise, they might be exterminated. And extermination is the word used at this time to refer to the excessive harvesting and the pushing towards extinction of commercial animal species like whales and seals. In his view, unmanaged exploitation was wasteful, and so this played into an early 20th century conservation ideology and philosophy coming out of the United States, wise use. But it wasn't just management or authority by anyone. I think Morrison, like others, other scientists, thought that it was Britons and Australian Britons who were the better environmental stewards. Much better than the Norwegians, who were the dominant part of the whaling industry and who were seen as excessively rapacious. Though Morrison and his British confreres often casually ignored the fact that British capital was profiting quite a bit from whaling as well. Morrison even speculated that penguin eggs might be harvested. He thought they were very much like duck eggs. And he was convinced by his own experience that if you took a pair of penguin eggs from a nest in Antarctica, that the female would simply lay another pair that season and all would be right. And so it was based on Morrison's work that Australia claimed the Australian Antarctic territory, so that orange part on the map there, in 1933. Worth noting, because this will come up again later, that essentially no other countries have ever recognised the legitimacy of Australia's claim. The experience of the Southern Ocean wasn't only an elite or high-level drama or experience. The ocean was experienced by workers. It was a labouring field. In the first half of the 20th century, the main labour was whaling. The great majority of the whalers were Norwegians, but through recent work, we know that, give or take a few, there were probably 132 young Australians, mostly Tasmanians, who went to work in the whaling industry at this time from Hobart. Between 1923 and 31, two Norwegian companies used Hobart as a port to access the Ross Sea whaling fields. And the Norwegians were partly mystified why Australia never created a whaling industry to go to Antarctica, so they quite happily filled the void, and notwithstanding Morrison's attempt to drum up an industry. Working on a whale ship was grueling. It's grueling work in cold, incredibly cold, damp, windy conditions, in addition to which there is the extreme danger of cutting up large dead whale bodies on a ship deck that's moving at sea, often leading to grave injury and often death as well. Many whalers, and the Tasmanian men included, reflected and wrote what we know of their experiences. They recognised the brutality of their industry, but they also recognised that they needed a living. So it's very interesting to consider. They were very aware of what they were doing, but what they kind of needed to do for their own livelihoods. One of the Hobart boys was the young Alan Villiers, who would go on to become a prominent mid-century maritime writer. Although I'd be intrigued to know if anyone in the audience has ever read any of his work. I wonder if he sort of lost a bit to memory, but was quite prominent in his time. From the 1940s to the 1960s, I would argue that the Southern Ocean was a space that, officially at least, Australia wanted to get through rather than dwell in. It was really a highway to allow Australia to properly occupy the continent itself with its scientific station. Australia was an original member of the International Whaling Commission from the late 1940s, and the 1950s was really the catastrophic nadir of whaling in the Antarctic. But these are, Australia really wasn't central to these developments. What happens after this was major international and structural changes beginning from the late 1960s, which were profoundly affecting Australia's and all coastal nations' relationships with the oceans. It was a revolution in the law of the sea. For centuries, it had been understood by the European powers who were writing international law and enforcing it on others, that the sea was an open space which no country owned. For a range of contradictory reasons, this underwent seismic shifts after the Second World War. In the 1970s, all UN parties negotiated a new law of the sea, which created and codified new maritime spaces, which allowed coastal states new spaces to possess, control, and exploit. Most notably, the creation of the Exclusive Economic Zone, the EEZ, a space of up to 200 nautical miles from the shore, indicated on this contemporary map in green. Australia, being an island continent distant from other land masses, benefited immensely from these changes in the international law of the sea. Australia has declared the EEZ of the Australian Antarctic Territory, but like the territory itself, this is not recognised by other countries, as well as being affected by the Antarctic Treaty, which I won't discuss. So I think these legal changes, which Australia has taken full advantage of, had a profound effect on the way Australia officially, culturally has looked upon the Southern Ocean. Even though, we don't have a giant fishing industry, I do think it's heightened a sense of possessiveness over this ocean. These big legal changes intersected at the same time with changing exploitation in the Southern Ocean. So by the early 1960s, whaling was effectively over in the Southern Ocean, notwithstanding small amounts by some countries. And in the 1960s and 1970s, led by the Soviet Union, Antarctic krill became a new fishing prey. So even though they're only small animals individually, growing to 6 centimeters, they're not microscopic, Antarctic krill is the largest wild animal on Earth by biomass, so by collective weight. On average, there are at least 350 million tons of them at any one time. And in the 60s and 70s, they were seen as a world-saving and world-feeding source of protein. But as you might imagine, given the sort of rise of environmentalism and the experience of excessive whaling, there was a worry that if you harvested too many krill, it would have flow-on effects through the entire Antarctic marine ecosystem. And this led states to negotiate Ccamlr, the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, signed in 1980. And Australia was a leading conservationist proponent of these negotiations. It really saw, partly I think drawing from the fact that it had this sense of possessiveness but no grand industry in the Southern Ocean, it saw that it had to push for protection in the Southern Ocean. And so Ccamlr today is the main international forum through which Australia engages with the Southern Ocean. And let me give 2 examples of the kind of contemporary history of Australia and the Southern Ocean, partly inflected through Ccamlr. One example which I think highlights the kind of territorial possession conservation experience all wrapped up in one is this 2002 example. In August 2002, an Australian customs surveillance ship spotted a ship fishing illegally in the Heard Island Exclusive Economic Zone. Surveillance of such activities was heightened in the late 90s and early 2000s because of this issue of illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, IUU fishing. And toothfish, so these sort of very large, gargantuan, terribly ugly fish on the right there, toothfish had really exploded in various consumer markets in the 1980s and 90s and had become a valuable illegal catch. The Australian ship identified that the offending ship was the Caribbean flag vessel Vyasa, which had been known to have illegally been operating for several years already in the Southern Ocean. The Australian ship went to apprehend Vyasa, but Vyasa bolted. Since the offending actions began in the Heard Island EEZ under international law, the Australian ship was allowed to chase the Vyasa once it left the EEZ. This is known as hot pursuit. And as you can see from the map, Southern Supporter apprehended Vyasa 1 in the South Atlantic after 21 days of pursuit and nearly 4,000 nautical miles. It travelled almost 4,000 nautical miles. And it's apparently the longest hot pursuit in maritime history. The final sort of example from this protection, exploitation, possession narrative, it comes today in the last decade and a half. Australia, with other countries, has been pushing strongly for marine protected areas in the Southern Ocean, so MPAs. This has been a sort of this has seen a rocky road since Ccamlr is a system that requires consensus rather than simply majority voting. The push here has been to, especially by environmentalist organisations, to create very large areas where no fishing can happen. Australia, along with countries like Britain, France, US, Argentina, Chile, and the European Union, are really strongly in favour of MPAs. Whereas there are more fishing-oriented countries like China and Russia, and to a much lesser extent, Korea and Norway, who are less convinced of the necessity of MPAs. And one factoid you might take away from this is that Norway is still the largest krill fishing nation in Antarctica. You might infer from the countries I've just mentioned that there's a strong element there's a strong way in which modern geopolitics, the tensions between China, Russia, and the West, that overlay these serious conservation discussions too. So I'll end there. That's a very broad look at Australia and the Southern Ocean in the past 120 years. I think you'll have seen one big change, which is a move from, exploitation, even if managed, to a very strong push for conservation and significant protections. But also I think there's a continuity here, which is the ways in which Australia officially and in other ways expands itself territorially and in other ways outside the space of the continent. And I think just as sort of the last point is that, thinking through the fact that we live in times of rapid, major, near catastrophic environmental change, I wonder how we need to be self-critical about how our nation, whether it's the government or industry or civil society, thinks about how we as a nation occupy very large parts of the earth, in quasi-imperial, territorial, colonial ways, even if it is for good purposes. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Sandra, and I'll just invite Alicia back to run the Q&A.
Thanks, Al. Thanks, Sandro. That was, it sort of took us back, but just that space, I really felt like that contrast between the open space versus, people trying to possess it or countries trying to, dominate it in some way, really struck me. And we've got our very first question coming in from Peter, and he asked, does CCAMLR have any coercive powers, or is Antarctica in fact a free-for-all?
That's a very good question, Peter. So Ccamlr, like many international organisations, does not have a police force. However, it does have, it does make regulations around, for example, how much krill can be caught, how much toothfish can be caught. So, and it's incumbent, like all international treaties, it's incumbent upon countries instituting that with their nationals. By all accounts, I think the members of Ccamlr, the countries who are members of Ccamlr, are generally good at enforcing many of those regulations. And, this is a fairly technical field, so the regulations apply in many ways. The kind of fishing gear that a ship, an operator can use are also regulated through these, through Ccamlr, like other fishing organisations. I think Ccamlr as well has been good, the toothfish example and IUU fishing, illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, that was seen as a really major issue in the 1990s for the Southern Ocean. And there were other conservation issues like bird bycatch. So toothfish are caught on long lines. So, these are lines that are kilometres long with hooks, regularly spaced. And albatrosses, and petrels were suffering very significantly on these long lines. And I think Ccamlr has been seen as a successful mechanism for significantly reducing bird bycatch. Like all international systems, of course, if a country that isn't a signatory wants to do something, they go and do it. But and of course, in the marine realm, things like flags of convenience, so Panama, Bermuda, Liberia, these are countries that sell cheap registration for ships and don't necessarily regulate those ships very well. So it's hard to manage, but I think it works well enough.
And you were saying at the end, you kind of hinted about Australia's you know, our expansion outside the continent and thinking about how we do that or how we continue to do that. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think it's, I think people can be surprised. You know, sometimes the historian is here to say how old a thing is, but sometimes we do need to say how radical or new a thing is as well. And I think the creation of the exclusive economic zone in the 1970s really gave, you know, it transformed the way countries live with and interact with the ocean. And I think it came with responsibilities as well as opportunities. You know, the opportunity was to be able to exploit to your own benefit fish populations, such things. But the international law actually also says that there are conservation obligations as well. They're not quite as strongly drawn in legal terms, but they nevertheless put obligations on coastal states to make themselves think about how to sustainably interact with and manage ocean resources. So there are tensions. I mean, I think this interacts in interesting ways, for example, with Lynette's work in that a pre-invasion, a pre-colonization, a highly porous, especially northern, you know, sea world, you know, seascapes. You know, of course, the ocean seems, you know, that is highly inhabited. But an ocean like the Southern Ocean, of course, is very uninhabited. It's not, you know, it's not along regular sea routes. It's incredibly forbidding ocean. So yeah, I just think there's a tension there that, like all conservation, all human actions are trade-offs. And by reflecting on the history, by reflecting on what we've inherited, so we need to, the self-reflexivity that we've inherited a sort of conservation vision from a highly imperialistic vision. You know, the self-reflexivity, I think, is important at a cultural level.
Yeah. Thanks, Sandra. I'm going to invite Al back now. Thanks to people for their questions, and back to you, Al.
Thanks, Sandra, and we'll bring you back in at the end. Look, I'm delighted now to introduce Jo Christensen, who's coming to us from Western Australia. Jo teaches as a lecturer in history at UWA and works on the maritime and environmental history of Western Australia. And his publications include the co-edited volumes, Historical Perspectives on Fisheries Exploitation in the Indo-Pacific, which was published in 2014, and the book Pearls, People and Power, Pearling in Indian Ocean Worlds in 2020. So, and Jo's going to be talking about reconstructing a history of recreational fishing in Western Australia. So over to you, Jo, and share your screen when you're ready.
Sure. Thank you, Al. I hope everybody can see the slide there.
Yep, all good, Jo.
Good. And I'll just get the screen down so I can see it too. Can I thank the organisers and also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the part of the world where I'm speaking from this afternoon, the Noongar people of Western Australia. Thank the organisers for the invitation to be here and thank all participants for their interest. So what I'm talking about this afternoon is a recent and indeed an ongoing interdisciplinary collaboration with the government agency responsible for managing marine protected areas in Western Australia there, and a group of scientists that have that very rare quality of being interested in the past and in historical records and the potential inherent in them. At the same time, I'm I guess offering my own personal reflection on that collaboration. So obviously everything I say will be my views only. And I'll try to move through the presentation fairly quickly and obviously be more than happy to take questions at the end. So there are, of course, many types of fish, many types of fishing. The species of fish that I'll be, I guess, referring to throughout the talk are shown here on this slide. So species like the West Australian dewfish, pink snapper, bulging groper. These are, for recreational fishers, trophy fish. They're highly sought after. They're fish that are good eating, and they are demersal fish. They live in rocky and reefy habitats along the Western Australian coast. They have also been subjected to very intense fishing pressure, primarily from recreational fishers in the second half of the 20th century. The critical feature of this fishing pressure, as I'll explain more in a moment, is that it predates modern scientific monitoring. So whereas data on recreational fishing and its impacts dates back, within a Western Australian context to the beginning of the 21st century only, the fishing community has been actively exploiting these marine resources for a lot longer than that. So this is a situation that is hardly unique to Western Australia, hardly unique in Australia. It is indeed common around the world. Awareness that ecological change in the oceans extends across generations and far beyond the temporal scope of scientific understanding is the basis for the concept of shifting baseline syndromes. Shifting baselines is simply the idea that each generation takes the environment as they first perceive it and measures change from that point on. So, on an intergenerational basis, it means that, what is regarded as natural over time is sliding ever more towards more degraded states. It's not a new idea, the shifting baseline syndrome, but it has been profoundly important. It has forced scientists to look for evidence of change across long-term timescales. It has encouraged historians to contribute their methodologies, their insights in a context of multi or interdisciplinary exchange. And it's this context that provides the background for the work that I've been engaged in. So the aim, in a sense, is to address shifting baseline syndromes in a way that can assist with monitoring and management of marine reserves in Western Australia and specifically off the Perth metropolitan coast. And this map obviously will show all marine reserves in Western Australia. The ones I'm interested in are the two that are, as I said, lying off the coast of Perth. Marmy Marine Park, which is in the northern suburbs or off the northern suburbs of Perth, and Shoalwater Marine Park in the south. So these were created in 1987 and 1990 respectively. They were created quite deliberately in response to growing public and political concern over the depletion of fish and other marine populations in these inshore coastal waters. And they protect the sort of habitats that are the home of the fish species that I mentioned earlier. For each park, and this is the crucial point, scientific monitoring of the environment itself begins sometimes later. So far as modern ecological data sets go, these extend back barely a decade. So it's something that's begun relatively recently. There is then no credible scientific data specific to these areas before the second decade of the 21st century. There is instead only the potential of historical research to unearth information that can provide a point of reference to measure change and a benchmark or a baseline against which the current conservation efforts can be measured. In other words, historical information is actually critical to understanding the efficacy of marine protected areas themselves. So this lack of scientific data from before the early 21st century, again, is by no means uncommon. The situation exists around Australia, it exists around the world, and it has, as I've said, driven interest in the potential inherent in historical records to provide insights on long-term patterns of change in marine environment. Where Western Australia is perhaps a little different globally, although again, I think we can compare it to other parts of Australia, is that it is recreational fishing rather than commercial fishing that has driven a lot of the change that has taken place, a lot of the depletion of critical fish stocks, particularly adjacent to major population centres. Recreational fishing then promises to provide the more abundant and accessible body of historical information. So things like fishing club records, oral histories, popular media records have all been used elsewhere to document transitions in fisher behaviour and their impact on the marine environment, the changes in size and composition of catches that are reflected in recreational fishing records across time. I'm referring here in particular to the work that Ruth Thurston has done along the eastern Australian seaboard. And for Ruth, as for other historians, the National Library's Trove newspaper database has been particularly useful in this regard. You can type in the name of a particular species that you're interested in, and Trove will very helpfully furnish a volume of records for you to then go and examine. As many of you will know, of course, Trove is limited. It's limited by copyright law. Many newspapers, including most of the major mastheads, are only digitized up into the mid-1950s. So this is a problem that my collaborators had encountered. As scientists, as I've been explaining, they had an interest in historical records. They were aware of Trove. They had gone to Trove. They had literally typed in the name of the species they were interested in, and they would find reports of local catches. But for some reason, they weren't finding much beyond the mid-1950s, and they came to me for help. And it was fortunate that several years earlier, and in collaboration with other historians in Perth, I'd been involved in putting together a database that would, or not a database, but a resource that was designed to address this limitation in Trove. What it involves is a digitized collection of weekly fishing columns in the Sunday Times newspaper that commenced publication on a regular basis, on a weekly basis, in 1957. And using, I didn't actually have to do this work myself, thankfully, but a research assistant went through in the old-fashioned way with a pile, large pile of microfilm reels and a microfilm reader, and scanned these columns in, so we have access to this database. And so this is the basis of the research that I'll be talking about. The next stage is to extract from these weekly fishing columns, in an era that obviously postdates what's available in Trove, fish catch reports as reported by recreational fishers that are relevant to understanding the change that is taking place in these marine park areas. So in other words, fish catch reports that relate to reef fish species, single trips reports where catch details are specified, the size of fish, the number that are caught, and so on. And also critically where a location is specified, so we can actually pinpoint it as being part of the metropolitan region. So I did this. It took a very long time. The result was a database of around 1,100 catch reports extracted from over 2,200 newspaper columns extending across a 40-year period. And I just want to summarize very, very briefly some of the insights that have been taken out of this database, and then reflect on some of the limitations of it. So what this period shows, and I think this is a real crucial insight, is that it was a period, the second half of the 20th century, of quite profound transformation in recreational fishing behaviour, the intensity of recreational fishing, and obviously in terms of the impact that that has on the environment itself. It is a period marked by rapid uptake of technology. So, for example, we see echo sounders being adopted by recreational fishers very early in the 1950s, and then spreading really quite rapidly to be in common use amongst fishers by the end of the 1960s. A similar process takes place in relation to GPS devices in the 1990s. All of this goes towards increasing the efficiency of recreational fishing effort. We see a growing popularity of recreational small boat fishing, the advent of small aluminium and fiberglass vessels designed specifically for sport fishing. We see, and this is also critical, more boat ramps being built up and down the coast, marinas and other facilities to launch boats to fishing grounds that are adjacent, and improved road access to the coast generally. Improving speed and range of recreational fishing boats. So outboard motors appear in the late 1950s. They become cheaper and more powerful in the 1960s. Again, I mean, as I've mentioned, specialised recreational fishing craft begin to appear and become more and more common. All of this is taking place against the background of population growth, of increasing leisure time and rising affluence generally. So it allows me to frame these post-war decades as a period of rapidly escalating impact on the marine environment. So the figure that I'm showing here is not actually taken from the newspaper columns itself, but it does help to illustrate the change that is taking place. It's a page from a fisher's logbook in an area south of Perth. Now, there are two interesting aspects to this. On the right is the record of the daily catch. 38 jewfish, 10 queenfish, 2 snapper, these are pink snapper, 4 shark, dozens of red snapper, etc. This is a phenomenal catch from a single trip. Most dedicated fishers today would not catch this many fish in a year of sustained effort. Some wouldn't catch that many in a lifetime of trying. But this is a report from a single trip, and it's by no means uncommon. It reflects the sort of catches that have been reported on in the newspaper columns in this period. The second remarkable aspect here is that these fish are being caught from really quite close to the shore. They're being caught within sight of land, and you can see on the left of the logbook a coastal profile with various marks identified in it, and it was these reference points that the fisher is using to navigate to his fishing grounds. This is, I guess, representative of where recreational fishers were fishing and what they were catching in this earlier part of the period that I'm interested in. So in the Metropolitan Coast, with the harbour at Fremantle providing the main access point to the ocean, fishers were essentially fishing around Rottnest Island, around Garden Island, always within sight of land, never venturing that much further out, and nonetheless recording catches that are, by today's standard, astonishing. The technologies that they adopt, echo sounders and then later on GPS devices, faster boats, and also by virtue of the increasing access to the coastal environments that reflect the city's growth itself, allow them progressively to break out of these constraints. And so the footprint of recreational fishing is spreading ever outward as the intensity is also increasing. So in terms of the two marine protected areas or marine parks off the Metropolitan Coast today, it's like a wave of intense effort sweeping across them between the late 1950s and the late 1980s, when the parks are themselves created, a wave of effort that leaves these coastal marine environments depleted, if not degraded, ecosystems. So that's one aspect of the insights that we can take. Another, and this is what I find particularly interesting, is the way that fishers themselves respond to change in the environment. So at the broadest level, it's a shift from exploitation, an ethos of exploitation, to one of sustainability. Fishers once aimed to catch as many fish as possible. The success of a trip is measured by the quantity of fish landed. The skill, the eminence of the fisher himself is measured by the number of fish he catches. He is, of course, almost always a he. Step by step, this begins to change. Bag limits are introduced for the first time in the mid-1970s. The immediate response is for specific catch details to be less frequently reported in the columns themselves. There's a similar effect when GPS devices are introduced, insofar as fishers begin to be very coy about the locations of their catches. As stocks diminish, and this is something that we see taking place in the mid to late 1980s, as stocks diminish, as regulations continue to tighten, there are other changes occurring, and particularly in relation to values. So the rise of catch and release fishing, the shift to other forms of fishing and sports fishing, pelagic fishing, for example, rather than trying to catch fish to take home to eat. Increasing concern also reflected in the columns about observance and enforcement of bag limits and other regulations. So the good fisher is the one that only catches what he needs, the one that abides by regulations, the one that calls out fishers who are breaching the bag limits and so on. So these, and I'll begin to wrap up now. These shifts in values and behaviour, to my mind, are really quite significant. In terms of human-environment interaction, it represents a cultural shift, a profound cultural shift, and a cultural shift for a community that, according to various studies, comprises up to a quarter of the Western Australian population. It's important historically, it deserves to be brought to light. The problem is how to reconcile changes in human actions with changes in the marine environment itself, within the context or the framework of an interdisciplinary collaboration. So the research is designed, as I said at the beginning, to establish baselines that can inform modern ecological monitoring activities that can allow scientists to better understand the efficacy of marine protected areas. The problem, the difficulty that I'm confronting now, and this is, I guess, indicative of the work in progress nature of this research. The difficulty is that these shifts in values and behaviour affect the nature and consistency of the catch data that were extracted from the records, the newspaper columns, into the fish catch database itself. So I would have loved to have been able to say more today in specific terms about how the fishing activity impacted on the fish populations. At present, it's simply not possible. More work needs to be done. It's a question of drawing robust scientific conclusions from a non-traditional data set. So turning historical records into valid statistical insights requires the use of innovative methodologies. And you know, Ruth Thurston, who I've mentioned earlier, provides us a guide into how this might be done. There are others as well whose work provides this example. Unfortunately for me, it means going back to this database that I put together so painstakingly, reinterpreting the data and bit by bit discarding records that will not be useful according to these very exacting standards of proof. And again, this is not by any means a unique situation. In fact, it's one that I think has been quite common, if not characteristic of the field of marine environmental history itself as it's developed over the past 20 or so years. So when marine environmental history was in its formative stages, various critiques were made of this data-driven approach to analysing the impacts of fishing across time, to reconstructing past states of the marine environments. And one of the more strident critiques is outlined here by the South African historian, Lance van Sittert. A primary focus, this is his critique in particular of the HMAP initiative, which is one of the, I guess, main early and global research initiatives in marine environmental history. He says a primary focus on quantification and building historical database has tended to restrict context to the verification of historical time series and rendered the humanists the data serf of scientist model lords. Indeed, there is something quaintly Victorian about this Rankian search for reliable facts to be pressed into the service of positivist scientists, of positivist science. So as I sit going through my database a second time and discarding records that I think are really quite valuable because they won't hold up to statistical analysis, I have this critique echoing in my mind. And all the more so because Van Sittert goes on in his article to call for the writing of more mainstream histories, traditional narrative histories, albeit ones that are focused on human environment interaction in and around the sea itself. And I think it's fair to say that there are a lack of these in the Australian context, notwithstanding the different work that has and is being done. It's certainly the case in Western Australia. And then the other thought that echoes in my mind as I work through my database, the alternative approach of continuing down the path of interdisciplinarity. Traditional historical sources can be used to inform not only historians, but the scientific community and indeed the public at large. So Lauren McClanahan's work shown on this last slide is perhaps the best known example of this internationally, where she took photographs from the same charter boat company operating in the Florida Keys across the 1950s, 1970s and 1990s to demonstrate in a very striking way the extent of environmental change and environmental degradation taking place in this part of the world. So her work, like Ruth Thurston's, provides us, again, I guess, in these moments of despair, with hope and guidance. The challenge is one of integrating qualitative insights with quantitative data so as to better illuminate long-term patterns of ecological change at the same time as foregrounding both the role of human activity in driving this change and the way that various societies have responded to it. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Joe. Again, another sort of mind-expanding presentation. So thank you for that. And if anyone has any questions for Joe or indeed for our panel as a whole, we'll move fairly quickly to that. But we've got a question here from David, who says, thanks for the paper. You mentioned technology and other factors shaping the growth in recreational fishing, but did you look at the degree of influence they and also the industries associated with them have at the state and local levels to facilitate this growth? And was it a matter of political interest or were there other explanations?
Yeah, it's a good question. In terms of the technology itself, I guess to some extent what is happening is a shift in fish finding and fish catching technologies developed for use in the commercial sector to the recreational sector. And it's not just things like echo sounders or outboard engines or whatever the case may be. You know, it's nylon fishing lines, fiberglass fishing rods, more advanced fishing reels. And it is something that does seem to really take off in the late 1950s, and I'm judging that by what's reported in these newspaper columns themselves. But one of the more valuable insights into this is in the advertising, which is actually next to the fishing column, where various tackle shops are putting all this on sale, and it becomes big business. And this, I think, goes to the other aspect of the question, where, you know, and I'm sure it's the case in other parts of Australia. You know, the recreational fishing sector is very large. It's very important regionally to different communities. You know, where recreational fishers come for holidays regularly and spend money in the town and so on. And it translates into a large degree of political influence in the recreational fishing sector. And this, I think, is really quite interesting, because it is recreational fishers collectively who begin clamouring for regulations you know, in the 1970s, and governments respond by introducing bag limits, and then they're progressively tightened across time. The interesting point about all this too is that recreational fishing regulations, until very, very recently, and again, these are regulations that are mainly introduced in the second half of the 20th century. They're progressively tightened across those post-war decades. So again, if we go to, you know, resource like Trove, we don't necessarily get this insight. The regulations are framed according to what's socially acceptable, not what's scientifically credible or what's based on scientific advice in terms of what will, you know, best provide for the sustainability of an exploited or depleted stock. Instead, they're based on, I guess, on the one hand, the political pressure of recreational fisher lobby groups, and then on the other, what governments and departments, in this case the Fisheries Department, think will actually fly publicly.
That tension between exploitation and protection is just echoed through all of our presentations, and now Al's returned and we're going to open up to the broader panel. Thank you.
Yes, so if we can welcome back, thanks Joe, welcome back Lynette and Sandra, but also our colleague Susie Prochke from Deakin. Susie's going to chair this last bit of the Q&A. Hopefully, Lynette, there we go. Great.
Hello. Sorry.
That's fine.
She's muted herself.
Just for a moment while they settle down.
Okay. Great. Okay, so we'll start this question time for all our speakers today who are across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. I have to say I'm disappointed, Sandra, that we're not really allowed to refer to the Southern Ocean. I always thought that anywhere where you have to swim with a wetsuit classifies as the Southern Ocean, but if you say so. So I'll just encourage audience members who'd like to send some questions that you might have thought of now that you've seen the whole panel to write in. Otherwise, we have one from Christina Toomey. Hello, Christina. For Sandro, she says, to what extent do you see the creation of marine protected areas as a form of khaki conservation? And how wary is the UN of this form of territorial expansion under the guise of environmentalism?
It's a great question, Christina. I suppose it's worth noting that MPAs are really central to current ocean conservation agendas. You may have seen the news in the last week that the Convention for Biological Diversity is meeting in China soonish now. And they're trying to formulate the next 10-year plan. And, 30 by 30 is one of these big conservation agenda headlines right now, which is 30% of the earth protected by 2030. And that applies to both land and sea. So the old issue with national parks and protected areas on land is how do they exclude traditional occupants, people who traditionally rely on forests or whatever. That, of course, does have some applicability to oceans too, less so the Southern Ocean. What I would say is basically that the UN, I think the broad agenda right now is actually in favour of these kinds of ocean conservation territoriality, which apply differently in the high seas to the EEZ. So, I think people want countries with EEZs to make 30% of them protected. And the UN is negotiating right now a system for protection of the high seas. I think the bigger issue is less of khaki conservation and more of paper parks. So the idea that you just draw a line around an unimportant part of the ocean. All parts of the ocean are important, but less productive, maybe avoiding places where fish breed, et cetera, and so I think the greater risk, and I think the legitimate critique, or one of the legitimate critiques of this agenda, is paper parks. Basically, I'd be intrigued, Joe, in the terms of perhaps in the Australian domestic context, paper parks or versions of that. Perhaps close to Western Australia.
Yeah, look, it's a good point, and it was something that I was thinking about in response to the question, and as I was listening to you give the first part of your response. But it's certainly the case, and I can speak mainly about Western Australia. The marine protected areas are very much paper parks, so they are drawn on maps and shaded on maps and displayed very prominently publicly, but what it actually means in practice doesn't necessarily afford the same or the sorts of protections that you might think. So you're allowed to fish in a marine park subject to ordinary fishing regulations, unless it's a specially designated zone. So if I take, for example, the Marmion Marine Park, the first to be created off the Western Australian metropolitan coast, I guess quite a landmark and quite a precedent at the time, but in practice, I'm not too sure what difference it actually made, because people can still go and fish there, apart from a few very, very, very small zones that are essentially dedicated for snorkeling, for skin diving. So yeah, look, I mean, there is I guess a lot of support out there publicly for the creation of these parks, but just how effective they are, I think is certainly a question that remains open.
Joe, we've got another question for you from Alice Garner, who says she feels your pain about the problem of fishing data reliability. Putting stats aside, what is your sense of how recreational and commercial fishers see each other? Is that relationship changing significantly?
Yeah, that's an interesting question too. So a long time ago now, in fact, it was my honours dissertation project at UWA, I looked at conflict between recreational and commercial fishers in the first half of the 20th century, again in Western Australia. And this was at a time before either group had begun to fish in any sort of substantial way offshore. Most of the fishing was taking place close to shore, in estuaries and in inlets. In other words, in fairly narrowly defined areas. And there was a great deal of tension between the two. Recreational fishers didn't like commercial fishers. They didn't like to see commercial fishers netting fish, for example, in the Swan River or the Swan Estuary. There was always an ethnic dimension to it, because a lot of the fishers over here at that point of time were of Italian or Greek background, and that that sort of runs as an undercurrent through the criticism of commercial fishers being made by recreational fishers, and through their influence and by virtue of their numbers. There are all these really quite stringent regulations placed on commercial fishers in this period, the first half of the 20th century. In the second half of the 20th century, my perception is it changes. The two groups are much less likely to come into contact with each other, simply because they are now venturing out into the ocean. They're using boats, more powerful boats, faster boats, particularly in Western Australia, where you have the development of the crayfish industry opening up what we would call the Midwest Coast. That's the area between Perth and Geraldton. So there are all these new facilities that commercial fishers can use to catch fish to supply markets in the cities, but they're way out there in the distant blue ocean. So I don't think there's that degree of tension between the two groups in the second half of the 20th century that you will certainly see in the first half of the 20th century. What I think you do see increasingly is tension within the recreational fishing community itself, between those who are wedded to that earlier ethos of going out and catching as much as you can, and sort of marking the success of any given trip by the number of fish caught, and those that are keen to embrace new and more sustainable fishing practices, catch and release, and so on.
Thanks, Joe. We've got another question, which I think we'll throw over to Lynette, from David Harris. There was a discussion about the sea as a medium, as a workplace, and as a site for sport. Is the ocean also a site of exclusion? So in terms of acknowledging Indigenous fishing rights, economic zones in the Southern Ocean, or in terms of misunderstanding that recreational fishing is not environmentally neutral, or any other?
Certainly, the recognition of sea rights in some contexts is an act of exclusion, but also it's also often an act where people can collaborate, and it's a joint participation or joint management. So you get something particularly, say, not Southern Oceans, but up in the north, Torres Strait, where Torres Strait Islanders' rights around sea are not merely the right to fish, but also the right to conduct a commercial fishery and exclude other people's opportunities to do the same. They do not, to my knowledge, ever ban recreational fishing.
Do Sandra and Joe have anything that they want to add to that? No? Yes. Okay, we have one more from Al, who would like to ask. We've got just 1 minute to go, so to Lynette and Joe, and the tensions between contemporary Indigenous fishing rights and the tension with non-Indigenous fishers, which I think is sort of, yeah. Would you like to address that briefly in the next minute or so?
I think in a sense I already did.
Yeah.
That it's not about it tends not to be about people who want to do recreational fishing, and of course things like thinking of rivers, for example, where fishing rights also apply. It's not about excluding anybody. It's actually about joint management, and then again sharing the resources. Did you have anything, Joe?
Just very, very quickly, because I know we're out of time. Whereas I was speaking today about the metropolitan region and the waters off the coast of Perth, what's taking place in the rest of Western Australia in this period is another story altogether, one hopefully for another occasion. But the move of recreational fishers north, ultimately increasingly northwards into the Kimberley region, I think, provides perhaps a backdrop for the potential for there to be these sorts of conflicts. But it's not something that I've looked at.
Okay, and here comes Al to finish up.
Yeah, look, thanks so much, everyone. Look, I've just got a couple of things. I'm just going to share my screen once more. Just a couple of reminders. The colleagues, firstly, just a reminder, actually, Monash University Publishing. Sorry, hopefully you can all see that. Monash University Publishing basically helps sponsor these series, and so providing books to each of our authors. So thanks very much to them. And just a reminder that the next Making Public History seminar on the 23rd of September, Women's Lives and Women's Bodies. Also, I think very much likely to be by Zoom, given the current situation and so on and so forth. I'm going to stop. My screen seems to be doing strange things. So I'm going to stop that and just say, because we are on time, firstly, thanks everyone who's come along. We had about 55 people joining us at one point during this webinar. Thanks so much for all of you for participating. Thanks to my colleagues and hosts, Alicia Serrato, Susie Prochke and Margie Anderson, and particular thanks to Lynette Russell, Alessandro Antonello and Joe Christensen. It really has been fascinating to actually start in the ocean and look from that perspective back to the land, and I'm just utterly intrigued. And when I'm allowed out of the state and can get back to South Coast New South Wales where I grew up, and when I start snorkeling again, I'm going to see it all in different ways. So thank you all very much. It's been fascinating. This session has been recorded, so if you know people who've missed it and who'd like to see it, it'll be on the History Council of Victoria website shortly. And without further ado, I think we need to stop because we're over time. So thanks, everybody, and see you next time.